So we'll get ready to sort of kick off. We'll be welcoming other people in as we get going. We are recording this session as well, so it's available for learning and building on. So as we come to the first of this week of activities, my name is Phil Hadridge. I host this meeting. We've got a number of things in this session. One thing I'd mention right at the start is that this is a session which is in Chatham House rules, so please feel free to talk about some of the themes that we discuss here, but not to name people individually. So that would be the key thing. It's not confidential, but it's not totally open either. So there'll be information which we can share in terms of detail, but not in terms of the name of the person who said it. I hope that's clear. If there's anything you'd like to pick up or challenge on that even, please do put that into chat. It's an opportunity today after some opening remarks to go into a panel session. If I could have the next slide, please, Laura. We've got a few parts to this, quite a simple process. So opening remarks from Ivo and Natalie, and then go into our panel discussion with Q&A, and then a wrap at the end of the session from Joanna to tell us how the rest of the week fits together and what we're doing on each of the days and how it comes together on Friday. That's the structure of this session. So if there's anything that's not clear, please put that into chat. And Joanna, anything you'd like to emphasize there as we get ready to start?
No, just welcome to everybody, and yeah, please do drop questions in the chat as you think of them. We will hold it to the end of the panel before we start asking questions, but yeah, please drop them in as you think of them. And one of my colleagues will be compiling them all at our end anyway, so it doesn't matter when you ask your question. But yeah, welcome.
Perfect. Great, thank you, Joanna, for that. And we'll then keep going here and move into the opening remarks. And Ivo's at a conference in Geneva in the snow, or indoors watching the snow. So Ivo, over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Just checking if everyone can hear me.
Yes, that's great.
Great. Yeah, a big welcome also from my side. So those who don't know me, I lead the UNEP Climate Finance Unit. It sits in the ecosystem division, and hence we focus particularly at scaling up public and especially private finance towards sustainable land use, food and agri systems, because those are at the heart of the planetary challenges that we're all facing. If you go to the next slide, and the next slide, please. For those who've been here before, I think what we've tried to do and still trying to do is to try and converge around how to frame, measure, and report positive impact in a as standardized way as possible. Because if you look at renewable energy and energy efficiency, it is a relatively homogeneous way of how to measure the impact in terms of tons of CO2 emission reductions achieved. Whereas when it comes to land use, there's so many different aspects of it that a lot of investors cannot see the forest through the trees. And as such, we've tried to develop, for example, a KPI directory to try and standardize the way how positive impact is measured. But equally important, how do we ensure that the chance of adverse risks are minimized as much as possible? I'm sure all of you here on the call know about the IFC performance standards, which are generally considered the gold standard when it comes to environmental and social risk management. However, of a sample that we looked at, 65% are committed to the IFC performance standards. And given that this is often a requirement by many DFIs, it also means not meeting the IFC performance standards can be a reason not to go forward with an investment, even though the potential upside may actually be there. So the question here is, how do we balance the need for prudent and effective risk management with also the necessity of looking at potential projects and companies in the forest and agricultural value chain that can generate significant environmental social benefits, but simply are not at the type of risk management standards and procedures that is necessary by commercial banks, DFIs, and including the IFC. So I think this is to some extent at the heart of what we're trying to do. If you go to the next slide, please. basically, I've put together a few questions and phrases which I think will come up during the course of this week and the webinars that are going to be organized. The first is that investing in sustainable agriculture and forestry and restoration is inherently sensitive from a risk management perspective. So I'm sure you all have examples where you've invested in a business, you've done all the right checks and balances, the KYC, but may still be facing adverse, for example, reputational risk. So how to deal with that? To what extent are participating investors, banks, and businesses facing constraints in terms of the required and minimum risk standards? I can imagine, but would be interested to hear from you if some of your investors or donors are requesting different types of risk management procedures and standards that is leading to you facing constraints of how to implement all of these. Coming back to the IFC performance standards, for example, they are quite cumbersome, even for big businesses, let alone for small businesses. So how are impact investors, how are banks dealing with this conundrum between big and small, also knowing that in the land use space, there are a lot of smallholder farmers, there are cooperatives and SMEs that may not have the risk management standards in place yet to be able to apply for DFI finance. So how would you as an impact investor or bank deal with this difference between big and small? The topic of reputational risk was already mentioned, but as I said, even if you apply prudent risk management practices, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you on this call have faced reputational risk or instances where your choices were called into question, even if you have the right procedures and standards in place. And last but not least, and this is perhaps a question that needs to be answered, is there a need for further standardization of risk management processes beyond what is there already? And I would hope that both today's webinar, but also the webinars being held this week will shed a light on that, because basically we as a team are sort of trying to digest the key points that are coming from this webinar series as a way of framing our work program going forward. So would be very interested to know from your side the degree to which there's demand and need for further standardization of this. With that, I would like to hand back to Phil, and I really look forward to this series of webinars.
Ivo, thank you very much for that. In terms of the moment we're in after COP26 and how sort of confident you're feeling, and where are you this year as opposed to previous years? How's that for you?
I mean, I think the recent summits on food systems, on biodiversity, and also COP26 in Glasgow, I think really helped in creating further momentum. At the same time, I think science is not lying. 2020 saw again record amounts of CO2 emissions. We haven't turned a corner there. The amounts of depletion of say the stock of biodiversity is enormous. So in a way, I would see if the moment is not now, then when. So I'm heartened by the degree of interest, but I think that the types of commitments and the types of action is not commensurate with the urgency that we're facing. So in that sense, I would hope that this community, which is small but growing, is growing at in quantum leaps as opposed to in a gradual manner, because that's exactly what we need, in my view.
Right. Ivo, thank you very much for that. Good to have you with us today from your conference room in Geneva. So well done for making the technology work so well. And unless there's any other questions looking for chat, anyone want to put their hands up to come into Ivo? I'm going to move forward with Natalie now. So I think we're good to go. Ivo, thanks ever so much. Natalie, now you're in Luxembourg. Are you in Luxembourg at the moment?
I'm today in Zurich, so I go back and forth between Luxembourg and Zurich. That's
great, fantastic. So Natalie, good to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ivo, as well as Phil, for the kind introduction. I'm speaking today as an external advisor for the Luxembourg government, the Ministry of Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development, with whom I'm working since many years on international climate finance topics and also the international climate finance strategy. So it's like always, it's a real pleasure for me to attend this annual environmental and social knowledge exchange event that UNEP Land Use Finance Unit is organizing together with the colleagues from UNEP WCMC. It's always very interesting. Luxembourg is very happy to be able to support the UNEP Land Use Finance Program over the past years already with the environmental and social management systems, the common directory of indicators, the common approaches for environmental and risk management, and especially developing new business models for sustainable land use finance being at the core of this work that we are helping to finance. And it's really instrumental to help move the sustainable land use finance landscape further ahead. And I hope that this journey can certainly continue over the next coming years. It's a good collaboration. As Luxembourg is using its international climate finance budget to support this program, I would like to use the few minutes that I have to speak about the international climate finance program of Luxembourg going forward in the next years. So if I can have the slide, please. The next slide, please. Yes. So it's a little bit small, but you will see that the support of the Luxembourg Climate Finance Program towards the land use finance program is already on the way since a number of years. Together with this program, we're also supporting the UNEP Seed Capital Assistance Facility, where the Frankfurt School of Finance is the agent for implementation, and it also supports the forest landscape financing ecosystem with supporting fund development and also supporting pipeline development of the funds so that more investments can be made. The Luxembourg government has approved by the middle of this year the new finance program for the period 2021 to 2025. So this is a small typo. About 220 million euro have been approved. These are all additional to the official development aid, and the international climate finance will be spent on 7 thematic areas, where the natural capital, biodiversity, sustainable forestry, and land use is a key pillar of the international climate finance support. We are trying to strike a balance between adaptation and mitigation, and we really see natural capital, sustainable forestry, and land use as an area where we really have the opportunity to have both impacts on adaptation and mitigation. A strong focus is on supporting the private sector in the mobilization of funding for sustainable land use. And this is normally done not directly to private sector entities, but through implementation entities, like, for example, the UNEP Land Use Finance Program and the UNEP Seed Capital Assistance Facility. We have also a requirement to clarify the environmental and social safeguards for all the applicants, and also are now really integrating the gender consideration in the eligibility and selection criteria of all the activities Luxembourg is financing with this international climate finance budget. So a full integration of gender issues. I also would like to basically emphasize that today's topic is very important for the mobilization of sustainable forestry and land use investment vehicles. Avoiding negative impacts and mitigating them is really the first step of a good environmental and social management system. We see very clearly by mapping and mitigating risk and by showing that these risks are often lower in sustainable finance instruments and in traditional land use instruments, we can contribute to sustainable land use finance getting a broader acceptance in the finance market. Lower risk also mean often lower potential for future costs for the investees. And that directly translates into contributing to the financial attractiveness to such investments as well. This understanding can help really scale up the adoption of sustainable finance business models that especially we are trying to develop with the UNEP Sustainable Finance Program as well. At the same time, we also see, and you are probably aware of it, and you have a number of new regulations coming up for non-financial disclosure by large companies, for example, and also the sustainable finance disclosure regulations for the financial markets participants offering investments products, especially in the EU. These regulations request the disclosure of sustainability risks and principal adverse impacts to sustainability of investment products like funds, all type of funds, whether they are sustainable or not. So especially sustainable funds, which are often much smaller and have often lower environmental and social risks, also need to show these risk management systems and also need to relate to do no significant harm criteria alongside positive impact demonstration, and this especially in connection with the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. So what does it mean? This further increases basically the transaction cost and the management costs of such sustainable investment vehicles. So in my view, making data on principal adverse indicators and do no significant harm indicators more accessible to existing and nascent funds is very key. And linking these disclosure requirements to the core environmental and social management systems will be very important to avoid double work and also to avoid extra costs for the sustainable funds that we see coming up and that we want to further help to develop. So these are just some of the key challenges and opportunities around environmental and social risk management of sustainable land use funds. Ivo has also shown a number of other key central elements for our discussion today. So I'm very much looking forward to the session today, but also to the discussions over the coming next days, where we have a really interesting program having been developed by UNEP and colleagues. Thank you very much.
Natalie, thank you very much for your support and for the orientation there and for being part of this. Thank you for that. We're going to move forward now with Rodrigo into the next part. And if there are questions for Natalie, please do post them into chat and we'll keep an eye on those as we go into our panel discussion. So we can come back to Natalie later if we want to, and there are questions, but otherwise that seemed very comprehensive. Rodrigo, if I could bring you in. And
thank you, Phil.
In terms of this week and what we're doing and how this panel connects into it and then taking us into it. So hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is where we actually start with the knowledge exchanging. So in the past 2 years, this event focused on the demonstration of positive impacts, and we had a long discussions, and together we built what ended up being the positive impact indicators directory. On our side at UNEP WCMC, this event was always very helpful in terms of guiding what we do and providing information that's actually useful for people that are involved in the day-to-day management of funds and different facilities. So I said this year the idea was to explore a sister topic or a correlated topic, which is essential in this space, which is the management of risks. So in one sense, going back one stage and looking at how funds and facilities, and we've also invited some banks this year to managing their risks related to sustainable land use finance. And the panel now is intended to kickstart this discussion. So we have a panel now on managing risks in sustainable land use finance. We are bringing 3 speakers from quite different organizations, which I believe is interesting. So we will have a perspective starting from a more high level or strategic level, going down to best practices, and in the end hearing from someone who is actually implementing risk management on the ground. So we will start the presentations with Jessica Smith, who is the nature lead at UNEP-FI. She'll be providing a global perspective on the topic and showing how it connects to other global trends and initiatives that we are seeing. She'll be followed by Leah Sundberg, the scientist with the Rainforest Alliance, who will then be providing some insights on the Accountability Framework Initiative, so in terms of best practices and how this connects to the financial sector. And finally, we'll be hearing from Jill Schuckerman, who is an ESG and impact advisor to the Agri-Tree Fund. She'll be bringing the perspective of someone who is and has been for many years implementing risk management on the ground. And yeah, I guess we have then this flow from the more high level to the what's actually happening on the ground, which I believe will be quite interesting for the discussions we will have in the next few days during the workshops. I will now pass the word to Jessica, and each of the speakers will have 10 minutes questions and answers in the end, please.
Great, thank you, Rodrigo, and thanks all for inviting me and having me on this panel. So as Rodrigo mentioned, I'm the nature theme lead at UNEP-FI, and UNEP-FI is a partnership between UNEP and the private financial sector. So we have banking and insurance members, and we have a partnership with the Principles for Responsible Investment, who have 4,000 investment industry members, and we work with the leaders of those on nature and climate themes. So I'm going to start with the bird's eye view and give you, a really broad look at this topic from the policy, regulatory, and voluntary initiatives perspective. Then I'm going to go in and zoom in on what does this practically mean for sustainable land use financing and E&S risk in this space. So at the really broadest level, I think it's escaped nobody on this call that we've just had the UNFCCC 26th Conference of the Parties, COP26. And my colleague Remco Fischer, who's the climate lead in our team, he's done a great job giving a summary of the outcomes. This recent COP was really heavily focused on finance, and one of the major outcomes from our perspective was the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, who have together committed $130 trillion towards transition finance for climate. I think that money needs to be put into context. There are various targets that the GFAN signatories have committed to at different levels of ambition, but UNEP-FI are managing some of the platforms behind that, net zero banking, net zero asset owners, and more recently, net zero insurers. So that's quite an exciting development. At COP26, we also saw in the final Glasgow declaration that the parties emphasized the importance of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches, including protecting and restoring forests, reducing emissions, enhancing removals, and protecting biodiversity. We saw a lot more focus on biodiversity within the climate COP than I would say, in my lifetime or in my recent memory we've seen. I think one of the major outcomes as far as this event today is that more than 100 leaders committed to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030, which is quite ambitious, and put both public and allied private finance behind that effort. And we also saw mainly investors, 30 FIs, who represent about 8.7 trillion in assets, commit to eliminate deforestation from their portfolios by 2025 and also make new investments in nature-based solutions. There was also quite a lot of emphasis around adaptation finance and new commitments in adaptation finance, but still, still obviously that's much shorter than the needs would dictate. Then just before the COP, we also had the 15th session of the CBD Conference of the Parties. And, the CBD is dedicated to biodiversity, and it was an unusual COP in the sense that it's now been split into two parts. So the first and second parts the first part took place in Kunming, and the second part will take place in Kunming with some negotiations in Geneva in January. We had 99 governments who participated in that COP and who have promised to finish the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's a 10-year strategic plan for nature, which is basically about mainstreaming biodiversity into, the sectors and the financial system, and reforming incentive structures like subsidies that would be harmful to biodiversity. So that's certainly relevant here. And there is expected to be a clear call for aligning financial flows to biodiversity in a similar way that the Article 2.1c in the Paris Agreement does. And there's been a number of other pledges and commitments that I won't go into detail there, but quite a lot happening in the biodiversity space. And we expect, much clearer policy consensus around biodiversity in the decade ahead. Now, in terms of risk and disclosure, I think most of you will be familiar with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and that started as a voluntary framework that was market driven, but is now being picked up in regulation, and countries including the UK and Switzerland are requiring firms to disclose on climate-related risk. We also saw last year the launch of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is expecting to release a similar framework by 2023. That group is similarly seeing a lot of interest from regulators, and there's a potential, given that the TCFD, gained understanding amongst regulators and central banks in terms of the relevance, that there would be maybe a quicker path for nature-related risks in a similar dimension. Then also at the COP, but not directly, in the proceedings of the COP, but the IFRS Foundation launched the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is expected to converge all of these different disclosure standards and make it, much more practical for regulators to pick it up, and much more streamlined across the industry. There's also something many of you may be familiar with, the Impact Management Project, that's been looking at the definition of positive impacts, and that has now been concluded and relaunched as the Impact Management Platform. So it completed its initial task, and now it will live on as a new platform that's co-chaired by UNEP-FI and the OECD. Then in terms of regulation at a regional level, we're seeing a lot of activity from particularly the EU, and we will be expecting towards the end of next year corporate disclosure standards on biodiversity that I've seen a preview, and they are extremely rigorous and very surprising. And then many of you may have seen the news recently on the intended EU ban on deforestation-linked commodity imports. So then within the voluntary space, I mentioned GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance. Also, we have a huge growth in the number of Principles for Responsible Banking signatories, of which there's currently more than, I think, 225. It may be 250 now. It's growing every day. All of those banks have agreed to set targets. Many of them are setting net zero targets. Some of them are setting financial inclusion. Some of them are setting biodiversity targets, but they've agreed to set targets around their major impacts. Then specifically in terms of E&S risk and global best practice, the IFC performance standards, as Eva mentioned, maintain their status as the gold standard. They are, unlikely to be massively reviewed for various reasons, but I think an interesting development alongside that is the Equator Principles. So recently the Equator Principles spent around 3 years reviewing the principles, particularly around Performance Standard 7, which is around Indigenous people, but also around Performance Standard 6 on biodiversity and ecosystem services. I think what's interesting to watch around the IFC is not necessarily the revising of the performance standards, but the revision of the guidance note. So in 2019, they released 2 versions of the updated GN6 for biodiversity, for example. Now, also around IFC performance standards, I think many of you will be familiar with the, oh, sorry, someone at my door. You will be familiar with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Well, IFC has not directly responded to those, except to say that that the guiding principles are in line with the performance standards, and implementing the guiding principles will get you some way to achieving the UNGPs. So finally, what does this mean for sustainable land use financing? There's definitely, a trend that the norms are changing, and transactions are going to be under much more scrutiny, and there's going to be convergence of standards and metrics used to put individual transactions under more scrutiny. There is an effort to mainstream good practices and certainly combat greenwash. There's definitely some hesitation in the market, and higher expectations that are coming. And then I think that there's definitely a trend moving from safeguards and the do no harm to a positive impact perspective. And there definitely needs to be capacity built within FIs to move through this spectrum. But the do no harm and the safeguards is really the baseline starting point. I would also like to say that in terms of the funding available, it should be easier and easier to access funding around more sustainable transactions, given the general trends in this space. And also to clarify the difference between the risk management and the risk appetite, and coming together between E&S risk management and this positive impact space is understanding the what is an FI's appetite for risk. So quite a lot happening in this normative space, and I think my 10 minutes is up. If I can hand back to the moderator, and I hope that was a useful just bird's eye view.
Thank you, Jessica. I guess that's really interesting to have this overview of what's happening and how it connects to the topic that we are discussing here today. So it's a lot's happening, but there's still a lot to do as well. So we will now hear from Leah Sandberg from the Accountability Framework Initiative on their case on best practices and how this connects to land use finance as well. Hi, Leah.
Hi, Rodrigo. Thanks so much. And thanks also to everyone for having let me join this panel. I'm really excited to be able to be part of this conversation and talk a bit about the work we're doing through the Accountability Framework Initiative, and hopefully learn more about how we can work with many of the organizations joining today. So this is a really great opportunity to start a conversation from our end. Use of the Accountability Framework by participants in this audience to develop criteria for and assess progress of the companies and projects they finance is really a key piece of the work that we're doing to standardize, mainstream, and operationalize principles and practices for sustainable commodity production and trade that allows companies and financial institutions to meet commitments to forest protection, human rights, emissions reduction, and protection of biodiversity. So I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce the Accountability Framework Initiative for those of you who might not be familiar with it. And then I'll describe how it might be used by financial institutions to develop screening or assessment criteria, and a little bit of the work that we're beginning in that space. So next slide, please. So the Accountability Framework Initiative is a coalition of civil society groups. There are currently 27 of us, and we're always growing, engaged in eliminating deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and human rights abuses from agricultural and forest commodity production and trade. The coalition includes large sustainability organizations such as Nature Conservancy, WWF, and WRI, human rights organizations such as SAI, Verite, and the Forest Peoples Program, organizations that provide direct support to companies such as ProForest and Preferred by Nature, and reporting and assessment organizations such as CDP and Global Canopy. Next slide, please. The goal of the initiative is to develop and support use of the Accountability Framework, which is a standardized set of consensus-based definitions, principles, and guidance around best practices for agricultural commodity production and trade that's free from deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and human rights abuses. And since deforestation and ecosystem conversion are such important drivers of both land sector emissions and biodiversity loss, the framework supports users in achieving those goals as well. It's applicable across forest risk commodities and across locations globally. So it's really designed to be a all-purpose resource for sort of production and trade across the sort of forest risk commodities that we're all looking at. Next slide, please. The framework itself is built around 12 core principles. These include 3 principles covering the content and specification of strong commitments and policies, including definitions such as what's a forest, what's a natural ecosystem, what's deforestation, use of appropriate cutoff or reference dates for land conversion, and setting appropriate target dates for achieving policy goals. Next, in the orange there are 8 principles on key implementation processes, such as internal management systems, supply chain management, responsible production, engagement beyond the supply chain, and monitoring and verification. Principles that focus on performance sort of at the farm level or at the site level include principles on land acquisition and site development, land management and conservation, and restoration and access to remedy. And then finally, core principle 12 describes best practices for reporting on progress towards achieving those supply chain goals. So each of these 12 principles are supported by detailed operational guidance and how-to resources that the accountability framework provides. The framework is intended to be used by companies at all stages of the supply chain, as well as by policymakers, civil society organizations, and financial institutions and investors to support a common language and a shared understanding around these best practices. The hope is that this standardized approach can both save time, not reinventing wheels over again, and also create alignment and consistency among the many actors, initiatives, and tools that are involved in this space. So by using these principles to set requirements, criteria for clients, financial institutions can help ensure that the requests that they're making of companies are aligned with the requests and guidelines coming from commodity buyers, civil society, industry associations, and other stakeholders. And these principles can also be used as the normative basis for a comprehensive set of indicators that can be used for screening and assessment of both the risk exposure and the performance of agricultural and forest commodity producers and buyers. AFI coalition members that support and host reporting and assessment tools and platforms have jointly, as part of a working group over the past few years, developed a set of proposed metrics for each topic, for each of these core principles. And these metrics are being used to improve alignment among reporting systems and scorecards that sort of focus on this scope around for deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and human rights. Next slide, please. So for example, here are some sample indicators that could be used to develop criteria related to minimizing risk and impacts during land acquisition or site establishment, managing land to ensure long-term protection in ecosystems and human rights, providing for restoration and access to remedy, and more holistically to assess compliance with deforestation and conversion-free policies and commitments. So these are just these are just sort of to provide a bit of a flavor of the work that we're doing to align indicators and metrics across the scope of each of these 12 principles. Now, the key thing to remember, and really the most important piece of this whole puzzle, is that we as the Accountability Framework Initiative are not asking companies to report to us via these indicators or via any others. And we're not asking them to use the indicators that we are developing directly. Rather, a primary part of our work is to integrate definitions, principles, metrics, and our associated guidance into the existing infrastructure built up around deforestation and conversion-free commodity production and trade. Next slide, please. So this infrastructure includes standards and methodologies that support responsible land use planning and land use planning and land management, tools for monitoring and traceability, sector and industry platforms, reporting tools such as CDP forests and the new GRI sector standard for agriculture, aquaculture, and fishing, and assessment methodologies such as the World Benchmarking Alliance and Forest 500. So we work with all of these organizations to standardize the ways in which companies that produce and trade commodities are assessed. And the framework is very much, we sort of say, an Intel Inside kind of tool. There's at this point probably hundreds of companies that are following the framework's guidance without even knowing it. For example, the framework is being used by the Consumer Goods Forum's Forest Positive Coalition to guide the development of its commodity roadmaps and associated KPIs, by the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber as the basis for its policies and guidelines, by the UK Roundtable on Responsible Soya and the European Feed Manufacturers Federation to set sourcing guidelines and criteria for members, et cetera. So many companies are accessing the framework actually via these industry and sector initiatives in which it's embedded. In addition, for example, CDP has fully revised their forest questionnaire to align with the framework, and the Global Reporting Initiative and the World Benchmarking Alliance have used it to improve and revise key indicators. So working closely with these reporting and assessment initiatives to ensure that the questions they're asking around these topics are aligned, are consistent, are asking for the same information from these companies. We're also working to support processes such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science Based Targets Initiative to ensure that forthcoming guidance on land sector emissions also aligns with commonly accepted deforestation and conversion-free approaches. This includes collaboration to better define relationships between farm level and landscape level activities to prevent deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and reduce land sector emissions. The hope is that in this way, the work that companies are being asked to do to monitor, measure, and report on the land use change in their operations and in their supply chains can be a direct input into what they're being asked for in terms of reporting on land sector emissions through these various accounting and target setting initiatives. And then at the end of the arrow there, you'll see tools, platforms, and initiatives that are designed to support financial institutions in building portfolios that are aligned with the framework. And this work is very much just beginning for us, and we're really eager to work with the organizations participating in this conversation to help identify key activities, processes, initiatives, and gaps in this area. So for example, we've recently supported the development of the Deforestation-Free Finance Project's new finance sector roadmap, which is led by Global Canopy, Conservation International, Nature for Climate, and other partners, which is based on the framework and uses it to define requirements financial institutions should set for their clients. Ceres is another one of our coalition members, and they use the framework quite a bit to develop guides and asks for their networks of investors. So we're hoping to find ways to continue to find new ways to support financial institutions in financing commodity production that's protective of ecosystems, human rights, and identify farms and landscapes that align with biodiversity and emissions targets. This might be in the form of tailored guidance documents, support and corporate engagement, collaboration to improve available data on corporate risk exposure and performance. I think we're really very much trying to figure out what is useful to this audience and to your colleagues. And I'm very happy to discuss any of this further. So please ask any questions during the Q&A or reach out to me directly. And yeah, thanks again so much for inviting us onto this panel.
Thank you very much, Leah. It's great to see AFI continue to develop, and I've been following the initiative for a couple of years now. And yeah, it's great to have a common language so that we can communicate about the same things in the same ways. And I believe it will be immensely important for financial institutions as well, because to speak the same language that NGOs, initiatives, and companies are using in this space, and to be looking at the same topics. So I'm moving on now to the presentation by Jill Chuckman, the ESG and Impact Advisor from Agri3. Jill has been dealing with risk management on the ground for several years, not only with Agri3, but also with other organizations. And I guess she can bring this perspective of the challenges of actually doing this.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Yeah, so I'm going to briefly introduce the Agri3 Fund and then talk through the key elements of our process and highlight some of the challenges. I'll also draw on some experience outside Agri3. So what is Agri3? We're a fund that focuses on low and middle income countries, and we work through partner banks. So we enable banks to finance activities, to lend to clients for activities that are not normally financeable. And this is usually through providing guarantees. And the activities we support involve either forest protection or restoration or sustainable agriculture, and must also have local livelihood benefits. So for example, in Brazil, our support enables a commercial bank to provide 10-year loans, which are not normally available in the market, that finance farmers to restore degraded pasture so that it is more productive and disincentivizes deforestation. but also to restore the protected areas around rivers, streams, and slopes that they are required to protect under the Forest Code, but often don't have the finance to deal with. On the other end, in China, we're supporting an agrochemicals supply company expand a project to support smallholders, who are mostly female farmers, produce chili peppers and employ integrated pest management and other more sustainable production techniques. So we have a diversity of, potentially a diversity of countries, a diversity of crops and activities. So my role, working closely with the investment team, is to make sure that in pursuit of positive impacts, the sustainable agriculture, this forest protection, this better livelihoods, there are not unintended negative E&S impacts, so that in pursuit of the good, we don't get bads. And there are 5 steps in our approach. I'll just talk briefly through each one and highlight some aspects of particular interest, at least to me, and I hope to you guys. I'll talk about the exclusion list, which is what we don't finance, the policy, which is what we do finance and how we operate, due diligence, action plans, and monitoring. So the exclusion lists, these are really an important part of setting out a fund stall. Practically, there's a core set of exclusions that are used by the development banks. It's very useful to align with these as a starter, particularly because development banks are quite often investors in a fund, and so that's expected as a core list. An important factor to consider is one excluding specific activities? For example, we wouldn't finance operations in tropical moist forest. Or are we excluding types of business as a whole from finance, e.g. no companies that are involved anywhere in operations in tropical moist forest, even if the project brought to us is not one of these? I give that as an example. We wouldn't actually consider either. But thinking more widely, it's really important in exclusion lists to think about, if we're trying overall to support transition to more sustainable activities, then maybe the focus needs to be on excluded activities rather than businesses, if we want to help shift businesses from being involved in bad stuff to being involved in good stuff. E&S policy. So this is where we set out what we do as a fund and what type of projects we support and where and how. For Agri3, our policy defines both the positive impacts we're looking for and the E&S performance we expect of projects we invest in. The core elements of the E&S risk management are a requirement that projects we invest in do comply with national E&S regulatory requirements and are aligned with the IFC social environmental performance standards. And at a more detailed level, we also reference the EHS guidelines, which are sector specific. And usefully, most of those are translated into multiple languages, so they're really helpful to talk through with clients. To Ivo's point about, are the IFC PS too ambitious? I do tend to advise to focus on the objectives of the individual performance standards, which I think are really essential for risk management, although not necessarily all of the detailed expansion of them is relevant, and they're meant to be applied proportionately. But the objectives, I think, are absolutely spot on, and one should be careful about, one shouldn't get rid of those. Because we support projects that produce agricultural products, we do prefer projects that include a commodity certification, such as Global GAP, RTRS, and we're also getting interested in regenerative agriculture certifications. What we like about certification is that it binds the client into 1, regular reviews, and 2, continuous improvement. If we're doing 10-year financing, that's really important to get. A challenge we often face is that certification only makes sense to producers if there's market demand for certified product. And a second challenge is the real plethora of schemes, including national level certifications as well as the international ones we just heard about. So for example, Brazil is developing labels for various types of low carbon agriculture. So at a practical day-to-day level, comparing the certifications, determining what we expect of our ultimate client, negotiating with them on certifications becomes quite complex. Due diligence, this is the time-consuming part of E&S risk management. So it's a very iterative process of getting information, analysing and challenging it, getting to know the client and what drives them, and based on that, deciding if and under what E&S conditions we'll support a project. Our aim is always to visit the client and the sites involved as part of our due diligence. Although in COVID days, which look like they're going to go on forever, we're doing that via locally based consultants. We use a structured template to report DD findings to our investment committee. We do it in 2 stages. First, when we've got some initial information. Secondly, when we've probed in detail. In terms of challenges and due diligence, I think the biggest E&S risk management challenge, particularly in forests, in projects involving forest protection, is that the S in E&S is neglected. And I've seen in previous experience, though not in Agri3 because of what we're financing, too many projects or proposed projects that aim to protect vast swathes of natural forest and totally underestimate the effect this might have on people who live in or rely on the forest for access to resources and livelihood. And ignoring the risks to people, ignoring the S, makes it really much less likely that a purely environmentally based project will be successful over the long term. In terms of action plans, one result of our due diligence is always an environmental social action plan that sets out specific project-specific E&S requirements that are conditions of our investment. So for example, if part of our support is financing restoration of an APP area in Brazil, then the ESAP says, when do we need a detailed plan for this, and what monitoring and what data do we need? Then we use passive and active monitoring. The client sends us information periodically, usually 6 monthly, and we go and visit. We go and visit annually. So summing up, E&S risk management, constructive engagement, be skeptical, but try to find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. I guess it presents a scenario of the challenges and all the different things you will need to consider when actually implemented this on the ground. So.
Great, thank you all very much, and thank you to the 4 of you, Jill, too. And it's been great to have you here. And Joanna, do join us and tell us what's coming next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all our speakers. That's great to have you. And yes, I'm just now briefly going to recap on those events that everyone's been mentioning. I know many of you have already signed up to join us for the workshops, but I'll just quickly recap those now. So if I could just have the next slide, please. Thanks. So yeah, so this webinar was the starting point for a week's worth of events all around this knowledge exchange on the topic of managing environmental and social risks and land use finance. And we're really keen to get into the practical challenges and tangible ways of thinking through how to do better in this space in terms of managing risks and setting up processes around that for funds and others. So this workshop was the first of the week, and we'll have another workshop at the end of the week on Friday, which all of you are very welcome to join us for. And that will be a reflection on our learning across the week. But before that, we have 3 workshops on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, all at this time, so 1 o'clock UK time. in the hope that it will work for people across time zones across the world. And so tomorrow we'll be talking about eligibility criteria and exclusion lists. And then Wednesday will be on risk screening and Thursday on due diligence. So it's kind of different segments of this risk management process that funds will be going through. And these 3 workshops, you should already have registered if you're interested for them. There'll be small-ish groups and really discussion-based. So it'll be much more a workshop than a webinar. Come ready to chat. And we're really interested in looking forward to hearing from all the attendees. If you haven't registered and you would really like to attend one of these, please just send me an email and we'll see if there is space. And then on Friday, we'll be reflecting on the learnings from all three workshops. Sorry, so those of you that haven't been able to attend them all will get a brief summary of what's been discussed and any kind of key learnings or outcomes from them. And we've also got 2 great speakers, quite senior speakers as well. So we'll have Corey Pretorius, who's the Deputy Director at UNEP WCMC, opening our closing webinar, and she'll be talking about how this land use finance work and sustainable investment fits into the larger global picture of global goals around both biodiversity and climate change. And then finally, we'll have a closing remarks from Christophe Bessesier, who's the Forestry Officer for Forest Landscape Restoration at FAO, and again, commenting on how this fits into larger global goals. So yeah, really excited about the week and very much looking forward to meeting you all much more than is possible on a webinar in the workshops over the coming days. You should all have my email address, so let me know if you've got any questions or if you'd like to join an event that you've not yet registered for. So yes, I think that's about it from me.
Dana, thank
Phil,
you.
Yeah, over to you.
Great stuff. This is really useful. We're going to end this webinar now. If there's a final comment or question you want to make, please do put it into chat and I'll let you make your way out. I'd like to thank everyone who's been involved, all our speakers who've been involved in this session, but also Laura and Ewan who've been helping on the tech behind the scenes as well. So thank you everyone for this team effort. Thank you for the wider team of participants here in the learning we're going to do together this week. So if there's anything else you want to say, we're going to leave this session open as you let yourself out. Do type it into chat, but otherwise please leave, go to the bottom right of the black screen and press the leave button. And goodbye and see you later in the week. Thank you all very much.
Thanks everyone.
Safe travels.